Henry Reynolds, one of Australia's most influential historians, who's responsible for some of the most comprehensive and original research documenting the violence on Australia's frontier. He's written 9 books and is presently a research professor at the University of Tasmania. He joins us now from Hobart. And with me in Sydney is historian Keith Windschuttle, whose recent series in the conservative magazine Quadrant attacked the work of Henry Reynolds and others. He's also the author of The Killing of History, How Literary Critics and Social Theorists Are Murdering Our Past, and he's the publisher of Macleay Press. Welcome to both of you. Henry Reynolds, how would you describe the Battle of Pinjarra? Was it a massacre or a legitimate use of force in an undeclared frontier war?
Well, the word massacre doesn't bother me whether it's used or not. What it seems to me to have been was a fairly typical action in what is essentially an insurgency, where the forces went out and, despairing of arresting individuals, decided they had to punish the group, and that they reasoned that the sooner this was done and the Aborigines accepted European dominance, the better, that nothing was worse than an ongoing, small-scale, continuing guerrilla warfare. It flew in the face of what the situation was supposed to be, that the Aborigines were supposed to be British subjects who should have been come under the law and who should have been arrested and arraigned and put on trial and then convicted and punished.
Keith Windschuttle, you recently described this incident as both lawful and morally justifiable. Clearly, Henry Reynolds doesn't agree with that.
Yes, I think almost everything he said about it just then is wrong. It wasn't a general police action to sort of teach the Aborigines who was in control. It was a specific action to arrest an Aboriginal named Noongar, who was responsible for the death of Private Hugh Nesbitt of the 41st Regiment, who had been killed in an individual conflict. It wasn't a guerrilla warfare or any other kind of action like that. The Aboriginal Noongar had been identified by one of the other people in the fight who'd got away, and the Battle of Pinjarra started by the attempt to arrest this person. He resisted. One of his friends killed the superintendent of police who was trying to arrest him. They also wounded another trooper who was on the spot, and there was a general melee in which both sides exchanged fire. The troops had muskets, the Aborigines had spears. It was a genuine battle, and the suggestion that it's a massacre suggests that there are people who are innocent, whereas in fact warriors who are resisting arrest with violent means that actually kills the police are not innocent by any means at all.
Henry Reynolds?
No, well, that's all very wrong. They didn't kill anyone. There were 2 minor injuries, and one of the chaps fell off his horse and received concussion and died several days later. But to say he was killed on the spot is grossly distorting what occurred. I don't think in any way you would expect armed people, soldiers and police and settlers, to ride into an Aboriginal camp. That this sort of action would be taken if the presumed murderer was a white person.
In this case, it's very clear that the police and the troops involved had to do their duty. They had to arrest this particular person. I mean, you can't allow somebody to go around killing your own men and then say, oh, well, they're Aborigines, we won't do anything about it.
If he says that it was a legitimate action to arrest a known offender, that's a reasonable thing to say, but the known offender was shot. Why then were 20 or 30 or 40 other people shot?
Because all his comrades threw spears as well at the same time. And it wasn't 20 or 30 other Aborigines who were shot at all. The only people who were shot were those who were resisting and attempting to kill the officers. And the guy didn't die from concussion. He bled to death from a spear in the head.
He did not. He died of concussion having fallen from the horse.
Well, your source is a guy who wasn't even there at the time.
No, well,
you don't even know what went on the day. You haven't read Captain Rowe, who wrote his diary, on the spot.
All right. Now, wait a moment, Keith. You can't assume that at all. When you say my fellow was a bad observer, I think that's quite untrue. We're dealing with undoubtedly the most reliable diarist of early Swan River.
Who wasn't there at the time.
Now let me finish, please. Let me finish. And the most reliable reporter of events of the Swan River, a competent man who was a friend of the governor, who was on the Executive Council and the senior legal officer of the colony. He wrote his report on the day that he was given an account of it by the governor who was leading the expedition. He wrote it not for publication. He put it down in his own diary, and I think he is a better and more reliable witness than those who took part, who had something to hide.
All right, can I just interrupt? I'd like to take this discussion, if I can, from the specific to the general. Now, Keith Windschuttle, you've claimed, and I think you just made the claim a short time ago, you claimed in your article that traditional scholarly standards are no longer applied to works of Aboriginal history, and this is especially true with accounts of massacres on the frontier. Why do you say so?
Well, because of the uncritical attitude that historians have taken towards claims about massacres. In the early 19th century in Australia, there were a number of people who had vested interests in talking up the violence about the Aborigines. If you were an enemy of the governor, for instance, and there's a case of Henry Melville in Tasmania who was jailed for criminal libel by Governor Arthur, then you write reports to London saying the governor is a wicked man and he's doing terrible things to the Aborigines and you should recall him. If you were a missionary and you wanted funding for your church and your missions, you said, look, there's so much violence towards the Aborigines, I need all this money to protect them. If you were a military officer and your regiment had been accused, as many of them were, of laziness and incompetence, you said, oh no, we've been out fighting the blacks. And similarly, you had pastoralists who in their old age wrote memoirs for their grandchildren saying, look, when we opened up the country, we had to fight drought, flood, bushfires and the blacks. All right, now, all these people have particular reasons for exaggerating this story. What the historians have done is taken everything they say at face value and have reproduced it. If somebody says, oh, there are 8 Aborigines killed here, they just say, the historians say, OK, we'll add 8 more to the toll.
The trouble is with Keith that anyone at all who suggests that there was killing on the frontier, he finds some reason, he dredges up something to try and discredit them. He is acting as a defence counsel for the settlers and the government. Now, that's all right, I don't mind him doing that, but it is a very selective way that anyone who stands up and says, look, they're killing blacks out there, he finds some reason, whatever it is, to say, oh no, they can't be believed.
Well, again...
No, let me finish. Whereas those who say there weren't any massacres, he says, these are the people we should believe.
OK, well, that's completely false, because there are some massacres which I've acknowledged, I've written about, they actually happened. There was the Myall Creek massacre where 28 innocent Aborigines were killed. But what you have to remember there is that the rule of law on which British society was founded did actually operate there, and 7 of those responsible were executed for the crime.
Let's stick, if we can, to the method. What do you say is required of historians where there's no forensic evidence, for example?
Well, you need sort of journalistic evidence. You need eyewitness accounts of someone who was there, of someone who saw the bodies. Even second-hand accounts where there's a sort of internal credibility will do. But the method that Reynolds uses in Queensland is extraordinary, and even though I taught this sort of history for 10 years, I never investigated the material that, on which these estimates were based. I thought that Reynolds had actually done some research. When I actually went into the sort of research papers that underlie his claims in his book, The Other Side of the Frontier, I found that it's all based on mathematical formulas. You take an estimate of the number of whites who are killed by Aborigines, you multiply it by 10, and there's no explanation of why you pick 10, and then you add another 20% to get 10,000 deaths in Queensland. Yet Reynolds doesn't have any idea about, doesn't have any credible account that there were eyewitnesses, that there were bodies of 10,000 Aborigines in Queensland at all. It's simply the application of a mathematical formula, and that's not how you do history.
Henry Reynolds, that's not how you do history, according to Keith Windschuttle. Is it an accepted historical practice to use these ratios as a method of determining or suggesting how many people were killed in these frontier battles?
Now, let's go back a bit. Keith is telling me and telling your viewers the way I do history. Keith doesn't know how I do history. He never bothered to ask me. He has read an article I wrote about 25 years ago, or 20 years ago, and makes assumptions about how it was put together. And most of those assumptions are wrong. Having spent a lot of time researching Queensland history, let me say that the evidence for extensive violence is massive and everywhere you go. Every single frontier newspaper is full of discussion about conflict. Now, the debate in the 19th century wasn't whether Aborigines were being killed in large numbers on the frontier. It was whether it was justified or not. No one that I have found in the literature doubted that this was going on. And what is more, there was a force, a quite discreet police force, a paramilitary force dedicated to that purpose, that rode the frontier for many, many years shooting people, and no one had any doubt that that's what they were doing.
Look, the native police that he's referring to now is something which, in his own books, in his book Black Pioneers, he says, look, the records, the native police were set up in 1857, but all the records from 1859 onwards are lost, according to Henry himself. So we don't really know what they did. On the other hand, in Victoria, the records all remain intact, and we have very good evidence of what they did, and the author of a book based on those records, Murray Fells, says that the native police in Victoria were a force for peace, that they prevented depredations by Aborigines against whites and by white settlers against the Aborigines. So in Victoria, where we have good evidence, the Aborigines were a force for peace. In Queensland, where the evidence is lost, you want us to believe they're a marauding band of killers. I mean, it's so implausible as to be a joke.
Well, can I ask a question here? Henry Reynolds, how do you as an historian guard against exaggerated claims, tainted evidence, second-hand reports when you put together an account of a massacre?
By having a lot of experience of researching the material and having some sense of what is likely. Now, but let me go back to what Keith said. Now, this is an indication of how distorted the picture he's presenting. Now, firstly, I know that that's what the native police did because the responsible ministers over many years said so in Parliament. They said the native police shoot Aborigines whenever they are seen. No one said that was wrong. No one contradicted that. They said so in Parliament, publicly and often. Now, if that isn't evidence, I don't know what is. Well, now, let me finish.
Often was once as far as your own documentation is concerned. They said it once in Parliament.
No, Keith, no, that's the only bit you've read. I've read many others, and I could give you chapter and verse now if we had time. That is the responsible ministers who, in public and private, said the native police are there to shoot Aborigines whenever they are seen. Now, what do you think they were doing with their guns and their vast supplies of ammunition, shooting bottles off fences? And what do you think they were for?
Well, if you don't have the records, you can't say.
Well, that's where we come
to... You admit you don't have the records.
Keith, if we have a police force that is dedicated to dispersing the Aborigines, we know that in their instructions dispersing meant to shoot at, and if we know they were doing this for 30 or 40 years, and that it was one of the largest items on the Queensland budget, what do you think they were for? Now, I can't, because the records were destroyed, quite understandably, you say nothing happened.
No, I don't say it at all. I say you don't have the evidence to know what they did do. And one comment in Parliament is not enough to explain 30 or 40 years of what went on.
It is not one comment, Keith. I explained to you. I can give you many others.
You've only ever cited one, Henry. You ever cited one.
I'm going to have to interrupt because we could go on with this toing and froing forever. But Henry Reynolds, you've said Keith Windschuttle is like a Holocaust denier, but you've also said that his questioning of the established orthodoxy does indicate some courage. So I'm wondering, how important is it that this process of questioning historical truths continue, that this debate continue, in your opinion?
I have absolutely no problem with this debate. I mean, some people say, shock, horror, how dare he? I don't say that at all. I mean, this is, in my case, this is work I did 20 years ago. It's something that I, you know, have long left behind, but it is important that it is dealt with. And, of course, one of the problems is that history, as Keith himself has argued, to some extent gave up empirical sort of research. So no one bothered to go on with this sort of work. But I think we should treat the conflict on the Australian frontier as seriously as we treat the wars overseas. That is, we set up proper research programs to go and do it in detail, as we've done with the War Memorial dealing with our overseas wars.
Keith Windschuttle, is your case a campaign to force historical precision, or is it an attempt to prove that modern historians are somehow tainted by ideology?
Well, I got started in this business when I read Philip Knightley's book, Australia, the Biography of a Nation, where he said that what the Australian settlers did in the 19th century had been done by no other civilised society until the Nazis attacked the Jews in the middle of the 20th century. Now, on other things I knew about Australian history, because I taught it for the best part of 20 years, I know that just simply is absurd. And so I started to look at the basis of which those claims were made. Henry doesn't compare the Australian settlers in the 19th century to the Nazis, but he leads people like Knightley, who's not an historian, and other journalists and other commentators right up to the edge of that little conclusion. They jump off, and we've got this both anachronistic, inaccurate, and this view that really distorts the nature of history for all people who come in their way, because we now have people who assume that the Australian settlers were a bunch of Nazis, therefore they go looking for evidence that will prove that case. So it's both a political issue now about the character of the Australian nation for the past 200 years, but it's also an issue that, in my view, is seriously distorting the kind of research that is being done in our universities and by historians generally.
Henry Reynolds, a final comment from you?
I am quite convinced, after the work I've done, that my estimate of 20,000 Aborigines killed on the frontier will be borne out. I have no doubt about that. I don't think 20,000 is the precise figure. It may have been a little less, it may have been a little more, but there was substantial killing, as you would expect, as settlers came into Aboriginal country without paying any respect to their ownership or their traditions. What else would we have expected?
We'll have to leave it there. Henry Reynolds, Keith Windschuttle, thanks to both of you for joining us tonight.